Okay. Good morning, everyone, and good evening to those joining us from the U.S. And thank you very much for joining this event. And this is the first of 3 workshops we are organizing on the possibility of applying cooperative threat reduction to the Korean Peninsula. We have a really wonderful participant today. And by the way, my name is Chung In-moon. I'm Vice Chairman of APLN and also Chairman of Sejong Institute. And I was instrumental initiating this project from the beginning. We are honored to host these workshops, which are sponsored by the ROK Ministry of Unification and MacArthur Foundation, and also Nuclear Threat Initiative provided very kind support to this project. It is our hope that this workshop will contribute positively to the conceptualization and implementation of corporate threat reduction plus approach, plus meaning in the public health, in the context of renewed diplomatic approach to DPRK. As I pointed out, this project was kindly supported by the Ministry of Unification. We are very lucky to have a Minister of Unification, Lee In-young. Minister Lee has been serving as a longtime member of National Assembly, and he was also floor leader of the ruling Democratic Party of Korea. And also, he has been a strong supporter of this cooperative threat reduction approach. Because a lot of folks in Korea argue that the CTR is too premature. And even those in Washington have been arguing that North Korea has not showed any changes, and applying CTR to the Korean Peninsula might be too premature. But Minister Lee has been staunch supporter of this approach, and it is very lucky for us to have him here. And also, the Minister Lee served as the chairman of a special committee of Inter-Korean Economic Cooperation of the National Assembly. He will be delivering special remarks. And after that, he has a cabinet meeting that he has to leave this session. Therefore, let me invite the Minister Lee to give a special remarks on his approach to CTR and the future of the Korean Peninsula and denuclearization. Minister Lee.
네, 감사합니다. 존경하는 문정인 이사장님, 그리고 샘넌 의원님, 또 마티 나탈레가와 장관님, 그리고 참석해주신 모든 기빈 여러분, 정말 반갑고 귀한 시간 함께 할 수 있어서 기쁩니다. 대한민국 통일부 장관 이인영입니다. 오늘 북한 비핵화를 위한 협력적 해결 방안 모색이라는 주제로 한미가 함께 국제회의를 개최하게 된 것을 매우 기쁘고 또 뜻깊게 생각합니다. 먼저 이번 회의를 주관해 주시는 아태 핵 비확산 군축 리더십 네트워크의 관계자 여러분들께 특별한 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 또한 기조연설과 발표, 토론을 준비해 주신 많은 전문가 여러분, 또 정부 관계자 한 분 한 분께도 마음 깊은 곳으로부터의 감사와 또 환영의 인사를 전합니다. 특별히 이번 국제회의에서는 지난 역사 속에서 국제사회의 핵폐기 경험이 한반도 비핵화에 어떠한 가능성과 시사점을 제시할 수 있을지 함께 논의해보는 자리가 되기를 바랍니다. 북미 간 대화가 장기간 교착되면서 북핵 문제의 시급성과 관여의 필요성이 제기되고 있는 가운데 때마침 아주 시적절한 시기에 이번 자리가 마련되었다고 생각합니다. 이 시간을 통해서 북핵 문제 해결을 위한 보다 실효적인 전략을 함께 모색하고 한반도의 새로운 미래를 향한 기회의 창을 우리가 같이 열어낼 수 있기를 희망합니다. 존경하는 참석자 여러분, 지금 한반도의 정세는 낙관도 비관도 할 수 없는 매우 유동적인 국면에 놓여 있습니다. 한반도 비핵화와 평화 정착을 위해서 다시 전진해 나갈 수 있는 기회와 대립과 긴장 고조의 악순환으로 되돌아갈 우려, 그 모든 가능성이 동시에 존재하고 있습니다. 잘 알고 계시듯이 지난 2019년 하노이 노딜 이후 북미의 협상은 답보 상태에 머물러 있고 남북의 대화와 접촉도 중단되어 있는 상황입니다. 이런 가운데 올해 초 미국의 바이든 행정부가 출범한 이후 한미는 긴밀한 조율과 또 협력을 통해서 남북미 대화가 재개될 수 있는 중요한 토대를 마련해 왔다고 생각합니다. 한미는 한반도의 비핵화와 평화 정착을 위해서 외교와 대화를 통한 평화적 해법, 그리고 조율되고 실용적인 접근 등에 있어서 공감을 이루었고 판문점 선언과 북미 싱가포르 공동성명 등 기존 합의의 성과를 이어나가기로 합의한 바 있습니다. 또한 미국은 북한에 대해서 적대적 의사가 없음을 강조하면서 전제 조건 없이 북한과 만나서 대화할 것임을 밝히고 남북의 대화, 협력, 관여에 대한 일관된 지지를 표명하고 있습니다. 저는 남북미 간에 합의한 한반도의 완전한 비핵화라는 최종 목표는 여전히 유효하고 각자가 대화의 가능성도 여전히 열어놓고 있는 만큼 협상을 재개하는 출발점으로서 과거에 비해 상대적으로 나쁘지 않은 여건은 이미 조성되어 있다고 생각합니다. 다만 북미 대화가 장기간 재개되지 못하고 있는 것은 상당 부분 상호 간의 신뢰 부분에서 부족함이 있는 것에서 기인한 바가 클 것입니다. 그러므로 북미 대화를 재개하기 위해서 또 북미 대화를 촉진하는 한편 북한이 안보 우려 없이 비핵화 과정을 결단하고 실행할 수 있도록 하는 실효성 있는 비핵화 전략과 현실성 있는 로드맵을 마련하는 것은 우리가 지속적으로 모색하고 또 고민해 나가야 하는 과제라고 할 수 있습니다. 즉 협상과 대화를 재개하기 위해서는 북한의 발걸음을 견인하고 재촉하는 것뿐만 아니라 한반도 비핵화의 과정과 결과를 전부 아우르는 창의적이고 근본적인 해결 방안을 모색하는 노력이 매우 중요해졌습니다. 오늘 논의하게 될 협력적 위협 감소 프로그램, 즉 CTR은 북핵 해법에 대한 구체적인 논의를 이어가는 과정에서 중요한 역사적 경험과 시사점을 제공해주는 사례라고 저는 생각합니다. 아시다시피 CTR은 과거 구소련 붕괴에 따라서 핵무기를 승계하게 된 우크라이나, 카자흐스탄, 벨라루스 등의 국가들이 비핵화와 안전보장 그리고 경제 지원을 교환하면서 평화적으로 핵 폐기를 이룬 성공적인 프로그램이었습니다. 당시 1990년대 초반 냉전이 종식되는 과정에서 미국을 포함한 관련국들은 비핵화를 인류 공동의 과제로 인식하고 이를 평화적으로 해결하기 위해 적극적으로 중재하고 지원하였으며 핵폐기 당사국들 또한 핵무기 보유의 이익보다는 사회 경제적 발전의 이익이 더 크고 중요하다는 올바르고 또 현실적인 판단을 통해서 핵폐기와 그에 상응하는 지원을 받으면서 CTR을 성공적으로 완료할 수 있었습니다. 물론 북핵 문제 해결을 위한 비핵화의 경로와 방법 또 상응 조치들은 협상을 통해 구체화되어야 할 사항이고 구소련의 비핵화와 한반도의 비핵화는 지정학적 또 시대적 맥락과 관련국의 이해관계 등이 서로 다르기 때문에 단순히 비교하고 또 적용하기는 어려운 일일 것입니다. 그렇다 하더라도 현 시점에서 지난 CTR의 사례가 주었던 그 시사점을 북핵 문제 해결에 참고하며 한반도판 CTR을 구상해 보는 것은 몇 가지 측면에서 유용한 접근이라고 저는 늘 생각합니다. 먼저 안전보장과 경제 협력을 포함한 포괄적 비핵화 모델의 수립이라는 측면에서 CTR은 매우 중요한 시사점을 줍니다. 북한 입장에서는 비핵화의 진전에 따라 대북 제재의 단계적 해제, 또 평화협정, 북미 관계 정상화 등 구체적 상응 조치에 대한 기대가 큰 것인 만큼 핵폐기 이후의 청사진을 구체적으로 제시하게 된다는 점에 있어서 북한에게 CTR적인 그 모색은 협상의 유인과 동력을 제공할 수도 있을 것입니다. 실제로 CTR은 핵폐기 이행 과정에서 당사국의 비용 부담을 덜고 또 핵 프로그램에 관련된 인력과 시설의 민수로 전환, 그리고 다양한 경제 협력 등을 병행하는 한편 관련 국가 내 협정을 통해서 핵폐기 국가의 안전을 보장한 바 있습니다. 다음으로 비핵화 과정을 뒷받침하기 위한 제도적 장치의 마련이란 점에서 CTR이 주는 시사점은 또 큽니다. 과거 CTR의 이행 과정에서 미국은 오늘 함께 하신 샘넌 의원님 등의 공동 발의를 통해서 넌 루가 법으로 알려져 있는 입법 조치를 초당적으로 마련해서 지원한 바 있습니다. 이를 기반으로 협정의 준수와 또 이에 상응하는 보상 조치가 상호 간에 성실하게 이행되었던 점도 성공적인 비핵화에 크게 기여한 것으로 보입니다. 이미 남북 간에, 북미 간에는 판문점 선언과 북미 싱가포르 공동선언이 존재하기 때문에 이를 바탕으로 향후 협상을 통해서 구체적 합의와 이행의 방안을 얼마든지 제도적으로 뒷받침해 나갈 수 있다고 생각합니다. 세 번째로 다자적인 참여와 지원을 통한 비핵화 과정의 투명성을 확보할 수 있는 점에서도 CTR은 매우 유용한 접근의 시사점을 줍니다. CTR의 적용을 통해서 초기부터 참여국들이 관여하게 되고 핵을 폐기하는 북한과 또 이를 지원하는 국가 간의 원활한 협력을 통해서 보다 검증 가능하고 투명한 비핵화 과정을 진행해 갈 수 있기 때문입니다. 나아가 한미를 포함한 관련국들의 협력과 지지 그리고 역할 분담이 이루어진다면 북한도 이러한 비핵화 과정의 선순환에서 쉽게 이탈하기 어려울 것이고 지속성을 마련할 수 있어서 결과적으로 불가역적인 비핵화가 촉진될 수 있을 것으로 기대합니다. 이러한 시사점들 외에도 CTR 프로그램을 직접 경험하고 또 연구해 오신 해커 박사님 등 여러 전문가들께서 오늘 이 자리에 함께 하시는 만큼 한반도에 적용할 수 있을 만한 새로운 지혜와 또 통찰력을 충분히 얻을 수 있을 것으로 저는 기대합니다. 존경하는 참석자 여러분, 북핵 문제는 한반도 평화에 있어서 반드시 해결을 해야만 하는 매우 중요하고 또 핵심적인 과제입니다. 비핵화의 과정 없이는 한반도 평화체제와 남북관계의 발전도 결코 근본적인 진전을 이룰 수 없기 때문입니다. 지금 우리가 가야 하는 길은 누구도 가보지 않은 길입니다. 또 완벽하게 따를 수 있는 사례가 존재하고 있지도 않습니다. 그러나 저는 때로는 한 세대에게 위대한 일을 성취해야 할 책임이 따르기도 한다. 이런 넬슨 만델라 대통령의 말을 떠올려 봅니다. 그리고 북핵 문제 해결을 위한 가장 중요한 문턱을 넘어야 하는 지금이 남북미 그리고 국제사회가 평화를 위한 책임을 다해야 할 때라고 생각합니다. 우리는 지난 성과와 시행착오까지도 모두 자산으로 해서 다시 한반도 평화 프로세스의 진전을 위해 나설 준비가 되어 있습니다. 북한 또한 길었던 숙고의 시간을 끝내고 완전한 비핵화라는 협상 목표를 통해서 비핵화와 제재 완화, 공고한 평화체제와 북미관계의 정상화, 그리고 남북관계 진전 등의 과제를 어떻게 해결해 나갈 것인가에 대해 하루빨리 논의할 수 있는 자리로 나올 수 있기를 기대합니다. 오늘 이 자리를 통해서 한반도가 분쟁에서 또 진정한 평화로 나아가고 대립에서 다시 공동 번영으로 나아가기 위한 긴 안목과 전략적인 지혜가 모아질 수 있기를 희망합니다. 참석해 주신 여러분들께 다시 한번 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 고맙습니다.
Thank you very much for your wonderful speech, Minister Lee. Now, I would like to welcome Dr. Marty Natalegawa, who is the new chair of APLN. Garrett Evans, who founded the APLN, recently stepped down, and Board of Trustees of the APLN appointed Dr. Natalegawa as a new leader of APLN. He served as the Foreign Minister of Indonesia from 2009 to 2014. Prior to that, he served as ambassador, Indonesian ambassador to United Nations. Welcome your speech.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Professor Moon. And most of all, thank you to Minister Lee for the important and significant remarks that he had just now made before all of us. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the Cooperative Solutions for North Korean Decolonization workshops. We at the APLN are very grateful to the South Korean Ministry of Unification and the MacArthur Foundation for making this project possible, and to the Nuclear Threat Initiative for their important support. For those who are unfamiliar with the APLN, we are a network of over 100 former and serving political, military, and diplomatic leaders working to address the security challenges in our region with a particular focus on nuclear non-proliferation, risk reduction, and disarmament. APLN carries out its work by producing and commissioning high-quality research and analysis, convening high-level events, building institutional partnerships, and providing a platform for dialogue and debate. This project on the cooperative solutions for North Korean denuclearization aims to address a critical missing element in the proposed denuclearization of North Korea through a cooperative threat reduction initiative. The original cooperative threat reduction program, or CTR for short, was originated by none other than US Senator Sam Nunn, who we are fortunate to have with us today, and Senator Richard Lugar. The program was initiated after the dissolution of the Soviet Union to provide financial assistance and technical expertise to secure and eliminate nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction in former Soviet states. CTR for the former Soviet Union was focused on the need to transition the nuclear weapons complex to non-nuclear weapons work and to reduce nuclear risk from migration, materials leakage, etc. This is also the case with the DPRK, but the complex is much smaller, and the opportunities for gainful nuclear-related employment in nuclear weapons or nuclear power is low to zero. The need to supplement CTR nuclear with other strategic benefits in the DPRK also diverges substantially from the former Soviet Union's case. Thus, other types of engagements are critical to the success of a CTR program for the DPRK, including missiles and space, energy security, and public health. We refer to such an expanded version of CTR for the DPRK as CTR Plus. In these three workshops, senior experts from the ROK and the United States will speak on how to conceptualize and implement CTR Plus in the context of a renewed diplomatic approach to the DPRK. As part of this process, we hope to stimulate creative thinking on the CTR Plus concept, the applications of lessons learned, and the principles that should underpin it moving forward. We wish also to encourage a much better, more widely understood assessment of the DPRK security problem and how it can be better addressed. And finally, we wish to table and disseminate a set of credible, workable policy proposals At the end of these workshops, the APLN team will produce a final report highlighting key points and recommendations from these discussions. So on behalf of the IPLN, I would like to thank you all for joining us and look forward very much to the insightful remarks, presentations, and discussions that we will have today, and hope that these workshops will move us one step closer to the potential implementation of an effective DPRK CTR Plus initiative. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Marty. Next, I would like to welcome Senator Sam Nunn, who is a co-founder, co-chair, and strategic advisor of Nuclear Threat Initiative. As you all know, he was the driving force behind non-Lugar cooperative threat reduction. Let us welcome Senator Nunn.
Thank you very much. Let me see if I'm off mute. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes.
Professor Moon and leadership of the Asia Pacific Leadership Network and Minister Lee, Minister of Unification, in particular, we thank you for co-sponsoring this series of workshops. And Minister Lee, particularly thank you for your encouraging and important remarks. So to all who are gathered, the experts, the policy makers, and the audience, which is participating this evening, I say thank you for your interest in this enormously important subjects. If you look back a couple of years to the announcement that there was going to be a Singapore summit between President Trump and Chairman Kim, my friend and I, Dick Lugar, got together and we said, hey, I think we may have a chance to make a contribution here. Let's get together our thoughts and write an op-ed on the subject of how the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, also known as the Non-Lugar Program, could possibly be utilized as a powerful tool in helping bring about a stable and nuclear-free Korean Peninsula. So we did publish an op-ed in the Washington Post, and we basically said in that op-ed that we had to have creative and bold diplomacy and think out of the box if we were going to really make progress in denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. We emphasized that achieving stability and security on the Korean Peninsula without a conflict would require unconventional thinking and steps that would be much broader than simply eliminating nuclear weapons. And that's already been referred to, and I think very aptly so, as the Cooperative Threat Reduction Plus, as was said just a moment ago. We basically, in the op-ed and in conversations with the White House officials, after the op-ed, we were invited to the White House to meet with Vice President Pence and also President Trump. And we recall the lessons in both the op-ed and in those conversations, the lessons of the Non-Lugar program after the breakup of the Soviet Union. In that program, has already been alluded to, we provided financial and technical assistance and cooperation to secure safely to handle and eliminate nuclear and chemical weapons, as well as delivery systems, the missiles, the airplanes, the submarines, so forth. So it was not just getting rid of weapons, it was also getting rid of delivery means, enormously important. And also to dismantle thousands of tons of chemical weapons safely, as well as dismantling biological facilities in Russia, in Belarus, in Kazakhstan, and in Ukraine. The bottom line in terms of the points we were making about the history that we felt might be applicable to the Korean Peninsula, there was about over 8,000 nuclear warheads dismantled, as well as thousands of delivery systems, as well as a huge number of silos, tunnels that had been used for testing, that were destroyed safely. And the key here is we did all of this safely. Another key is that, and I'll mention this in a moment relating to the Asia Pacific region. This was not just a U.S. program. The United States originated the program, and there was an agreement between the United States and Russia, and of course the other countries, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus. But the European leaders and their countries participated. So there was an awful lot of help here. The Japanese made a contribution. So these were the points that we emphasized in our op-ed and in the meetings with President Trump and Vice President Pence. After the op-ed, as this summit took place in Singapore, where at least there was the beginning of discussions, we decided that the Nuclear Threat Initiative, the organization that is a partner with the Asian Pacific Network, we decided that we were going to write a report. So there is a rather comprehensive report that Lynn Rustin, who is on the next panel, and Sig Hecker, one of the great experts in all of this arena, can discuss in their remarks, or anyone who wants to follow up can get a copy of this report. But let me just try to capture the essence of the report in 6 brief points. Number one, the North Korean leaders, this is an opportunity for a win-win. The North Korean leaders could take advantage of the cooperative threat reduction concept or program to gain support of their scientific and technical community and their population by treating this scientific and technical community with respect, and the program would utilize their expertise in carrying out the task relating to denuclearization and to undertake peaceful scientific work, working with other scientists, including those from South Korea, United States, Japan, and perhaps China and perhaps Russia also. So that's kind of point number one. Point number two is verification. Of course, verification is enormously important in any dismantlement program, and it's important to any countries that are going to participate in this program. So the CTR concept can be made a very powerful verification tool in terms of making sure the weapons and materials have really been eliminated. And one of the keys here is, and you can talk about this later in the panel, but the principle is most of the outlays of funding are payments that are made for the work that has been accomplished in a verifiable way. So this is not taking bushels of money and just pouring it out there. It's basically paying for work accomplished. Of course, there can be other programs that go along with this, like health programs, education programs, and other tools that can go with this. But the CTR program is basically paying for performance, and that performance is verifiable. The third point, and Sig Hecker, I've already referred to. You're going to hear from him, I believe, next. But Sig probably knows more about this overall subject than anybody on the face of the earth, both in terms of Soviet Union as well as what's happening in North Korea and the importance of applying these tools to the challenge of the Korean Peninsula. But building trust is something that Sig can tell you about, because he's been there and done that. Basically, building trust with scientists and engineers, because step by step over time, these people are going to be on the ground and they're going to be working to dismantle their own weapons, as well as the materials which have to be safely handled, safely transported. So this is not simply eliminating weapons, it's going much broader than that. My fourth point is that this is not a simple matter. And all of you, I know, that have looked at this challenge and looked at the CTR program as it applied to the former Soviet Union, understand that this is not flying a cargo plane in, getting a diplomatic agreement, flying a cargo plane in and picking up a bunch of nuclear weapons. That's not the way it works. As Sig says, the groundwork has to be done on the ground where the weapons are, and it has to be a cooperative effort with the North Koreans. You've got to end the fissile material production. That's a key element here. You've got all sorts of activities relating to ending the nuclear program as well as dismantling of the weapons. You've got to safely handle and transport both weapons and materials. So all of that is enormously important, and the scope of the program is very broad. My fifth point is that this has got to be a win-win. The North Koreans have to have some benefits flowing out of this, and I think they will have enormous benefits. They have to make a decision that this is an opportunity to transition their economy and to participate in the international community. So that's enormously important. This is not, the CTR program is not a detailed roadmap for diplomacy, but it is a program that can be a powerful tool and assist with diplomacy, even before there's an agreement. But there has to be an agreement, and there has to be cooperation, and there has to be willingness to carry out the dismantlement in a verifiable way. And so I would make point number 5 really that this cannot be done to North Korea. It has to be done with North Korea. That's enormously important. Finally, in closing, let me just say that this is not a job for South Korea alone or America alone. Certainly North Korea is going to be part of it, but it's also going to include, as did the CTR program in the former Soviet Union, we must have help. No country is better really qualified and prepared to help than Russia, because they've been through this on their own territory. And so getting the Russians involved, if they're willing to be involved, would be enormously important. And of course, China must play a huge role here. The involvement of Russia and China, of course, that's diplomacy, and at its probably most challenging. But I think that has to be part of the job. And of course, our friends in Japan have a huge stake in all of this in terms of regional stability and protecting their own security. So I would expect and hope that the Japanese would decide to play a very key role here. So this is indeed cooperative, and cooperation means a number of countries, not simply United States, South Korea, and North Korea. It has to be cooperative. So let me close by saying that no, Nunn-Lugar or the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program is not a magic bullet. It doesn't solve every problem, but it can be an enormously helpful tool, not only in implementation, which is where it really comes into play, but also can be a tool in creating a win-win in terms of North Korea, South Korea, Japan, and the people of the entire region. So let me close my remarks there and say that I look forward to participating in this workshop. I thank all of you who have made this possible. I think is one of the most important initiatives we could possibly envision in terms of taking a very serious challenge and a very grave set of dangers for the whole region and turning it into a real opportunity for cooperation. So thanks to all.
Thank you for your very rich and illuminating remarks, Senator Nunn. Now, let us just get straight into our first presentation for this session. Let me invite Dr. Siegfried Hecker. Dr. Hecker doesn't need any introduction. He's a supreme expert of North Korean nuclear issues, and he has the first-hand knowledge and experience of dismantling of nuclear facilities in the in the former Soviet Union and its republics, and therefore he will give us very rich implications from his experience in the Soviet Union and Russia for the Korean Peninsula. Dr. Hecker?
Well, thank you very much, Chagyen, and thanks also to the minister and to the APLN and everybody for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I have the most unenviable task of following Senator Sam Nunn, who pretty much said almost everything that needs to be said. However, if you use his comments and his suggestions and you combine that with the NTI report that he mentioned that Lynn Ruston had so much to do with, and I was fortunate to contribute some to that, that really lays out many of the key issues. Nevertheless, I was asked by the organizers of this overall series of workshops to add my thoughts, particularly based on my own experience, and that is my experience in Russia as well as in North Korea. And so I've done that in a pretty extensive paper. And so what I'd like to do now is to share and share my thoughts. And let's see if I can do that. And we will start with the slideshow as soon as I can find that up here. Hold on just a second.
At the far left.
There we go. Okay, so I will try to summarize as quickly as possible. And this is really just a sitting back summary and not dealing with the details that I put in my paper. And so let me start then in comparing sort of the best as I can see of sort of Soviet Russia and other states of the former Soviet Union to what we have in North Korea today. What I thought I would do is sort of compare the threat and then make sure we look at the size of the programs, look at the sophistication of the programs, and then look at the best term I could find is sort of connectivity of the people inside of these countries, former Soviet Union in one case, and DPRK in this case. And of course, as we look at the threat, and here's Senator Nunn, a few years ago, and he was put so well by David Hoffman, who used to write for the, and still does write for the Washington Post. So the threat was for how was the Soviet Union and then the former states of the Soviet Union going to deal with this inheritance from hell? And the inheritance from hell was, as one can say, with the four loose nuke problems: the loose nukes themselves, loose nuclear materials, loose nuclear people, loose nuclear exports. So the threat that we faced at that time was indeed not the nukes in the hands of the Soviet Union, but the nukes out of the hands of the Soviet government. And that's what the Nunn-Lugar program, in my opinion, really addressed. And they did this, and they fashioned the legislation before the official demise of the Soviet Union. If I look now at North Korea and say, okay, how do I see this threat? And these are just, my own opinions. And by the way, here's Kim Jong-un, and he looks as dapper and healthy as I've ever seen him look. And this is a very recent photograph of him. Nevertheless, the way I look at the threats is sort of the issue of the way a nuclear weapons could be used: misunderstanding, miscalculation, or mistake. An act of last resort, from a desperate government, possibly. Regime change, whereas so many people in the past have said what we need is a regime change. Today, with the nuclear assets they have, that's the last thing we want. And whether that regime change comes from external, internal, or from health-related problems. Perhaps an adventuresome military, since we know so little about them. And then, of course, we've always worried, the Nunn-Lugar program is always worried about the export of nuclear technologies, including the knowledge. So to me, then, the difference is the Nunn-Lugar program did not try to take away the nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union. They tried to get an overall reduction, but they dealt with the threats. Here, in the case of North Korea, however, the end goal, in my opinion, must be the elimination of nuclear weapons and the means of manufacture and delivering them. However, that's going to take time and it's going to take some patience. So I've advocated halt, roll back, and eliminate. Oops, let's see. Okay, so in terms of the size, just a really quick run through in terms of nuclear weapons, delivery systems, Senator Nunn mentioned facilities, and people. So in the Soviet days, this is what we were faced with in 1991. At one time or another, it is believed the Soviet Union had 39,000 nuclear weapons. They still had tens of thousands at the time. 1.4 million kilograms. Again, just focus on that, million, and not just kilograms. Loose nuclear people, several hundred thousand in the nuke complex, all the way around in civilian and military combined, 1 million. And then, of course, we were worried about loose nuclear export with an economy in chaos. So this had the making of a perfect storm. In comparison to North Korea, I won't go and read all of this, but you can see them. We're talking about kilograms of plutonium, hundreds of kilograms of highly enriched uranium. Tritium, you know, what you need for hydrogen bombs, very, very limited. Nuclear devices, not 39,000, but, you know, somewhere between 20 and 60. You know, my best guess is sort of 45. They do have the ability, in my opinion, to deliver them to South Korea and Japan, do not yet have the ability to deliver them to the United States, but they're certainly working on that. Okay, so if we then look and do the comparison directly, you can see what we're talking about, differences of 1,000-fold. Again, 30 to 50 nukes, you know, 1,000 kilograms all the way around of nuclear material, several thousand people, not several 100,000 people. And then export, yes, we have to keep our eyes on that because they did what I thought was, you know, two of the most egregious things from North Korea. That is the sale of nuclear materials, in this particular case, uranium hexafluoride to Libya, and then building a production reactor for Syria. Sophistication, let me just say, the scientific community as we look at it, again, dramatically different between the Soviet Union, Russia days and now. The Soviet Union had Nobel laureate scientists. What we're talking about in North Korea is competent engineers. So we don't belittle them because those guys are quite exceptional, but we're not dealing, you know, with world-class scientists. In terms of the knowledge, you know, sophistication, you can just remember, by the time Nunluga came around, the Soviets had 715 nuclear tests. That's how you learn how to design nuclear weapons and what to do with them. North Korea has 6, which is actually quite a bit. In terms of space and missile programs, again, the Russians were pioneers in those areas, in missile technologies. Again, the North Koreans are not pioneers, but they are competent engineers. So that's what we need to remember. Connectivity, what I mean by that is back even at the time of Nunluga, 1991 timeframe, we knew a lot about the Soviet military and the strategic rocket forces. We knew a lot about their nuclear complex because there was a lot of back and forth. There were lots of arms control related discussions and activity. We've had, you know, nothing of that nature in the technical or military arena with North Korea. Actually, there have been a lot of discussions with the political people. We actually know a lot more, in my opinion, about North Korean diplomacy. But we don't know anything about military or the technical world, except some of the things that my colleagues and I learned when we visited and when the Department of Energy people actually had feet on the ground. Okay, let's see. So then the lessons learned from, to me at least, from Soviet Russia CTR is, first of all, and this I already said, Senator Nunn said, it takes bold political initiative. It takes new thinking. It needs strong and sustained US political support. If you look at how the Nunluga program then actually was, you know, brought through the Congress, it was fantastic bipartisan support. And then Senators Nunn and Lugar had to continue to keep that support for all the years. Keep the focus on CTR. Don't get carried away with a lot of other things. That means cooperative. Senator, exactly. It's not what we do to them. We have to do it with them. Focus on threat, focus on reduction. Don't try to get to elimination immediately. And so these things must be done cooperatively. Involvement of technical professionals, Senator Nunn said it better than I can say it. So not only the technical professionals, but also the role of Track 2. It was key in getting to the cooperative threat reduction with Russia. The nuclear worker reorientation, which we'd all like to do, of my experience with non-Luga in Russia and former Soviet Union, yes, this is important, but boy, it's difficult. You know, you have to be careful as to what you think your objectives are. The objectives in the case of non-Luga were, you know, no problem with the loose nukes. And indeed, from that standpoint, those programs were successful. Then focus on bilateral, that's also been said, but welcome international participation. Now, let me just wrap it up, and I have details of this in my paper. The bold initiative that I've tried to push, sort of similar to the steps that were taken in cooperative threat reduction, is what I call cooperative military to civilian conversion. Okay, that would then leave something for the North Koreans that they would get from all of these years that they've done the nuclear stuff. Is that going to be a threat? Well, you're always going to have this problem. I mean, nothing is irreversible. You know, they can always reconstitute. We understand that. But the concern about the civilian nuclear program, in my opinion, has been grossly overplayed, especially today, when they've demonstrated they can do all of the weapons and missile-related things. And then just to throw in, because as I was going through in my research for pulling this together, and what I found that actually the closest comparison of North Korea and what happened in Russian CTR was in the chemical weapons arena. And what was done there was just remarkable. I mean, the United States helped the Russians get rid of 41,000 tons of chemical weapons. We can take the lessons from that and apply them to the North Koreans. And my view is we might be able to convince the North Koreans, because they're not going to give up their nuclear weapons at this point, because it's sort of their security blanket. But chemical weapons are not a deterrent. They're a terrorist weapon. And so one might be able to talk them. So that would be the way that we could actually do confidence building in the US political spectrum, if you can actually see the North Koreans walking through and getting rid of their 5,000 or so tons of chemical weapons. Okay, I've taken more than my time. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sek. Very, very insightful. And I really like the idea of using the term that instead of denuclearization, use a military to civilian conversion. I don't know whether audience in South Korea will accept or not, but I think that's a very innovative idea. Now let me turn to our second presenter, Namrata Goswami. Namrata is, I would say, the number one expert in space in Asia. It's very unusual, and she has been very, very active in promoting the study of, space issues. And I really, amazed that APLN could invite her, because she's a member of APLN too. And I would say that she will be one of the first, experts who have been arguing the space dimension, space engagement and cooperation with DPRK. The DPRK will love that idea. And let me invite Namrata to give a second presentation. Here you are.
Thank you, Professor Moon, and thank you to the Asia Pacific Leadership Network for having me today. It's a real honor. So in terms of my presentation, I've submitted a paper which has it in details. But what I'm going to do in the 10 minutes given to me is to talk a bit about if space cooperation or the possibility of mitigation of space militarization is at all possible with North Korea or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Now, as stated by the previous presenters, something that is very clear in terms of the context and the conceptual framework within which that occurs is simply that the Kim Jong-un regime, especially North Korean regime, has two insecurities that has to be dealt with in terms of any conversation or dialogue about space cooperation. And one is that the fact that the regime sees its nuclear weapons, including its missile development, as regime security weapons. And second, it's also connected to the continuation of a dynastic rule. Now, we also know that the North Korean regime has invested in missile development technology, including the intercontinental ballistic missiles. And that's where space comes in, actually, because if you look at some of the development of their ICBM technologies, it is pretty evident from the facts open source documentation that the unha, the Taepodong-2, was involved in some of the launch of that missile. And so this is the context in which we can actually think through whether space cooperation is at all possible. The environment for such dialogue is coming up, and especially as you see the Ministry of Unification, as well as Moon Jae-in, President of the Republic of Korea, and now Joe Biden, is talking about the importance of having a calibrated approach with regard to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And what is more critical is that Moon Jae-in, and I caught in that particular conceptualization that he gave, which is that we first need to actually start with dialogue. And only when we have dialogue, we can actually go to negotiations. And I thought that's something that my expertise can help in terms of deconstructing it. Now, if you look at North Korea's space program, it's led by the National Aerospace Development Administration, NADA, which was established in 2013. And in a statement that was released by NADA in 2014, they indicated that the DPRK has pushed ahead with space development projects to turn the country into a space power. And they also very critically passed a space legislation to regulate their space activities and are a signatory to the Outer Space Treaty since 2009. So these are certain facts that need to be kept in mind when we think about cooperation. Now, if you look at civilian space capacity, DPRK has the need for capabilities like remote sensing, geographic information systems, especially given the fact that it suffers from food crisis, according to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. And so what is interesting is that there are studies that are available that talks about how South Korean capacity can actually augment and help, for example, in terms of fishery, agriculture, monitoring of weather. Now, another sector where the North Korean interest is basically the mining sector, where you again can have the help of satellite-based support for augmenting that particular chapter. Now, as stated by the previous presenters, another country that has collaboration with North Korea is, of course, China. China can never be kept out of the equation. And China and DPRK actually wants to have some level of collaboration through their Belt and Road Initiative. DPRK is very much interested in getting investment from China's Space Information Corridor. And just this year, China reaffirmed its commitment to the 1961 China-DPRK Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance, which means that there is interest in developing that kind of capacity. Now, what are DPRK's own capacity in regard to civilian space? We know that DPRK successfully launched the K3 into orbit in 2012 on the Unha-3 rocket. And also the Komasong-4, the K4 was launched from the Sohae Space Center in 2016. But what is lacking in those particular satellite launches is that they did not beam any images back to Earth. So they showcased the capacity to launch, but the capacities that I'm talking about in terms of remote sensing, navigation, GPS, weather monitoring, they do not have that kind of capacity that has been demonstrated. So it is in this context where I think my paper can offer some interesting or significant insights, which is that space as a high-end technology could be viewed as an area of cooperation within the framework of dialogue and through a bilateral agreement that could be signed between NADA and the Korea Research Aerospace Institute. Now, I did a bit of calculation as to how much that might cost. So open source documents tell us that the Republic of Korea's space budget is about $551 million, 553.1 billion to be precise. And so they have plans to develop their own indigenous launch system, the Republic of Korea with the KSLV-2, and also in terms of developing their own, sending their own 1.5 times satellite on that particular rocket to LEO. Now, it is here that there could be some collaboration that can be seen. And if you do the calculation, it would be about 30% of the budget that will have to be put aside for developing DPRK's civilian space capacity. Now, the area of concern where I think space cooperation becomes critical is military space. So we know that North Korea and the Republic of Korea are located in the context of an area which has seen conflict, which has seen the escalation of space militarization from the part of Russia, including its ASAT weapon tests. So some of the concerns that we might have in terms of DPRK space capacity is that it could test an ASAT rudimentary capability because it does have a missile technology program, especially ballistic missile. It hasn't done so yet. Other capacities that DPRK has shown and demonstrated are, of course, jamming of GPS signaling, especially during the South Korean US games, military games, and also in terms of cutting off very significant signals to their own population. And so it is in this context that I can offer a framework that could be helpful. So in terms of the framework of space cooperation, this I draw from my own research on dialogue and negotiations. So there are certain facets of dialogue that are critical to be established before we can think about negotiating in the space arena. Now, Hal Sanders of the International Institute of Sustained Dialogue and the Kettering Foundation specifies that dialogue is a process of genuine interaction through which human beings listen to each other deeply enough to be changed by what they learn. Each makes a serious effort to take others' concern into his or her picture, even when disagreements persist. Now, I hear a lot of disagreements in the geopolitical context of the Republic of Korea and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, as well as historical differences that exist. One of the most important concepts of dialogue is inclusiveness. Now, inclusiveness is a process of dialogue that is based and informed by a problem-solving framework. The stakeholders in the conflict, despite the divergent views, interests, and strategic purposes, come together to work out a map of conflict prevention. Now, in the context of the Republic of Korea, the United States, and the DPRK, a plausible scenario of space cooperation will have to deal with the regime insecurities that I talk about in terms of the dynastic continuation of power, because if you listen to the conversations that you can draw, there are fears that if once unification happens, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea will have to democratize and Kim Jong-un would lose his own potential there. So the other important fear in terms of space cooperation, in terms of inclusiveness, is the presence of the United States in the Republic of Korea. And it is in that context that space collaboration with regard to space situational awareness, civilian space capacity, helping with how DPRK can actually monitor its own agriculture, flooding comes into critical importance. The second concept, I think, which cut across all issues of strategic importance is joint ownership. So it's very critical that the strategic dialogue between the US, the Republic of Korea, and DPRK happens within the framework of joint ownership. Now, joint ownership can actually work out in space. You can have joint ownership in terms of remote sensing, as I mentioned before, satellite internet, to the extent that it would be acceptable by the DPRK based on its own population control strategies, data on agriculture due to acute food shortages, as well as, very interestingly, space exploration. So both North Korea and the Republic of Korea have interest in going to the moon. The Korea Pathfinder lunar orbiter is under investment. And so DPRK has also announced that it wants to have a moon exploration program and become a space exploratory country. Now, is it possible to have some kind of collaboration that mitigates the military dimension of space, but actually importantly brings to the forefront the civilian, the more beneficial dimensions of space, which would require joint ownership and inclusiveness? Now, another important factor of dialogue in terms of space cooperation could be listening, learning, and adapting. And that is why I think when the Minister of Unification said his remarks to us, that if you want to have actual collaboration, including in the denuclearization field, you need to have a long-term view. And this is where learning, adapting, and looking at why DPRK wants to escalate, for example, in its military space capacity is very important in terms of building up that framework. Finally, before I end, I would say that there are 4 other important factors that needs to be kept in mind in terms of space cooperation. One is, of course, the Gandhian philosophy of empathy and humanity. There are differences in worldviews that exist between the DPRK, including countries like the United States, which is needless to be stated, but which is very much an important strategic concept in the Asia Pacific. Now, the other important point is that what happens when you do this kind of actual engagement, because there are also the component of self and the other, which means that the idea of Korean unification and the philosophy which it is based on of finding common ground, it'll be very interesting to see how DPRK views these particular objectives and what kind of collaboration, for example, in civilian space, it will put forward. Because in some of its statements, it has stated the very important requirement of having space capacity for its own shortages in terms of food and agriculture. Now, understanding of context, again, is extremely critical in this particular context, because if space cooperation occurs, it will have to be led by not just understanding of context, which means the critical context of the Korean War, the historicity, the fear of escalation of military space, the role of China and Russia, but also in terms of how transparent these processes can become, because it is very important to state that there is a level of trust deficit in this particular area, and that is where transparency comes in. Now, finally, I'll say that a vision for the future, which builds into the concept of dialogue that President Jain and then the Ministry of Unification stated, which is that what is the vision that we are looking forward in terms of space collaboration? Now, what is interesting is that the former executive secretary of the US National Space Council, Scott Pace, gave an interesting talk in Berlin in 2011, where he pointed out that there are certain conditions that would have to be met. For example, the fact that North Korea would not invest in an intercontinental ballistic missile, but also that it will have to give up some of its space launch capacity because of the fear and real concern, including in the United Nations, that this is a testing of missile technology. But despite that, he said that it is possible to collaborate because DPRK is a member of the International Telecommunication Union as well as a member of the Outer Space Treaty. And if you want to deal with issues like climate change, there are other groups like the Group on Earth Observations and UN SPIDER. I mean, this all happened, of course, before the DPRK showcase ICBM technology, given his analysis was in 2011. Now, I'll end by saying as to why this kind of space collaboration is critical. In the paper, I built out a scenario where we do not have any dialogue on space collaboration at all. What could that lead to? For example, a scenario I built is that possible collaboration in space between the ROK, the United States, and DPRK breaks down. Now, DPRK is now investing in military space capacity. It also is investing in a high altitude nuclear detonation, which is very possible if you put an EMP device. For example, a small hand detonation on one of its satellites could lead to an electromagnetic pulse that can have deep critical impact on low Earth orbit satellites. And in that context, it also gives notice that it's leaving the Outer Space Treaty. That can have very significant consequences. And that is why I think it is critical that we need to have a framework that looks long-term in terms of space collaboration with North Korea. I'm going to end there and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Namrata. The public session will end here. And I would like to thank those who have been joining us via YouTube live stream. Please look forward to the second and third webinars of this series as well. Thank you. Now, before we move on to the commentators panel and open floor discussion, we'll have a 5 short minute short 5-minute break and see you all again in 5 minutes. Okay, we'll have a short break and come back. Okay, thank you.